Imagine spending 4 years and over $200 million developing a brand new IP. It launches at $70, reviewers call it solid but uninspiring. It sells 2 million copies, a commercial disaster. The studio loses money and cancels all planned DLC. Now imagine spending half of that budget, polishing a game everybody already loves. You don't need to convince anyone of the concept, the audience already exists. The game launches and sells 10 million copies in its first month. Unfortunately, that is the reality for a lot of gaming studios these days. On July 9th, 2026, Ubisoft released Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced, a ground-up remake of the 2013 classic that sold over 11 million copies in its original run. Ubisoft is a company that, by its own admission, is in trouble. Multiple high-profile misses, stock price down significantly, they need a win. And instead of betting on something new, they've reached for something that had already won. The numbers behind modern game development are staggering. According to the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, AAA games launching in 2024 and 2025 require budgets starting around $200 million. Some titles, the bigger ones, are pushing past $300 million. To put that in perspective, a game that costs $200 million to develop needs to sell roughly 5 million copies at full price just to break even, accounting for platform fees, marketing and distribution. That's not just a risk, that's an industry where one failure can lead to the end of a studio. Take Forspoken, Square Enix's attempt at a new IP in 2023. The company described its sales as lackluster. The studio behind it, Luminous Productions, was absorbed back into Square within months of release. Or Immortals of Avium, a new IP from Ascendant Studios published by EA. It sold so poorly that the studio laid off nearly half of its staff within weeks of launch. Meanwhile, the remake economy tells a completely different story. Resident Evil 2 Remake releases in 2019. Development costs are estimated at around $50 million. It's now sold over 14 million copies, which is nearly triple the original 1998 release's lifetime sales. Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game built on a name that hasn't had a mainline numbered entry sell this well since the PlayStation 2 era. Over 7 million units, which has allowed them to continue with the planned trilogy. Dead Space Remake, 2023, built on an existing IP, existing level design, existing story, critically acclaimed, commercially successful. And then there's the Kotaku data. 67% of surveyed gamers said remakes were their preferred way to discover older games. 85% of those buyers had never even played the originals. It's not just nostalgia. These are a generation of players who want to experience these games, but won't touch a 480p PS2 version with tank controls. Remakes aren't competing with their originals, they're replacing them. Ultimately, remakes sell. Remakes are safer investments, but they rarely hit the same cultural impact as the originals. And the reason is far simpler than most people think. When Resident Evil 2 launched in 1998, the survival horror genre was a relatively new concept. Fixed camera angles, limited saves, and every element was designed around restriction. Those restrictions create tension. The 2019 remake is technically superior in every measurable way. Better graphics, smoother controls, more content, but it exists in a world where survival horror has been defined, refined, and iterated over 20 years. You can't replicate context, and you can't recreate the moment when something was genuinely new. The same applies to Black Flag Resynced. The original Black Flag wasn't just a great pirate game, it was a genuinely surprising pivot for Assassin's Creed, arriving after the mixed reception of Assassin's Creed 3. It felt like a risk. It felt fresh. The remake can polish every texture, improve every system, but it can't be surprising in the same way. The surprise was spent in 2013. And honestly, remakes are successful. They're celebrated, but they're moved on from. People forget about them, whereas the originals are still discussed decades later. The real cost of the remake economy isn't the money, it's the ideas that don't get funded. Every studio that greenlights a remake is by definition not greenlighting something new. There's only so many development teams, so many budgets, so many release windows. Between 2019 and 2026, Capcom released remakes for Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil 4. All critically successful, all commercially successful, and during that same time period, only released one new IP, Pragmata, which is proof that a new IP can be successful, given that it sold 2 million units globally in just over 2 weeks, and just on Steam had an all-time peak of over 68,000 players. But that's a risk that a lot of studios aren't prepared to take and can't afford to take. It's not an attack on Capcom specifically. It's the rational response to a market where a single new IP failure can cost $200 million and sink a studio. But the math that makes sense for individual companies creates a collective problem. The industry that gave us Resident Evil, Assassin's Creed, Final Fantasy, all of these started as a new IP. They started as risks. And if the economics of 2026 had existed in 1996, how many of those risks would have been made? How many of those products would have made it? So what did the industry do? It found the safest path. The safest path leads back to the games that have already proved themselves, sometimes decades ago. With that being said, Flag Resynced is probably going to sell extremely well. It's a great game, attached to a beloved name, at a moment when Ubisoft really needs a win. On its own terms, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you zoom out, and you look at the $200 million budgets, the studios that closed after one failure, the new IP that never got funded, you start to see that every remake is also a choice not to make something that doesn't already exist. The games that define this industry, the ones we're still remaking decades later, they weren't safe bets. They were risks. And the question worth asking isn't whether the remakes are good or not, it's what we're not getting instead. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Is there a series you'd rather see get a genuinely new entry rather than a remake? And looking back, are there any games that perhaps didn't do so well and then resulted in the closure of the studio, didn't deserve the quite harsh criticism that they received at the time? Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.